Hello, I'm David Hepworth. Thanks for clicking this word in your ear. The latest of hundreds of chats Mark Allen and I have had over recent years, some between ourselves and others with musicians, authors, comedians, and other people we like. If you'd like to help make sure they continue, you might consider being a Patreon supporter by visiting patreon.com/wordinyourear, or just by liking or subscribing in whatever way you prefer. On with the show.
You're listening to a podcast from The Word.
Dave, I have a stat waddy for you.
Oh, yes.
Inspired by the news that edgy indie rock prophet Richard Ashcroft is the soundtrack for the new John Lewis Christmas ad.
Oh, yes.
Which is called The Gifting Hour. They always have these fantastically pretentious names. You'll have a name. So I just looked up the John Lewis site, and here are some other unexpected soundtracks from John Lewis Christmas ads in the past. 5 ads, 4 of them real, and 1 made up by me.
Okay.
Spot the ringer. Yeah, I'm quoting from their website. There was an ad called The Feeling in 2009. This evoked the childhood joy of opening Christmas presents. A child delighting in a new camera morphs into her adult version, feeling the same excitement at the gift, to the sound of Guns N' Roses' Sweet Child of Mine. Okay, that's the first one. Okay. The second one was called The Long Wait. It was in 2011. This tearjerker follows a boy's anxious wait for Christmas morning, the kicker being that he's impatient to give a gift to his parents rather than open his own, to the sound of Please, Please, Please Let Me Get What I Want by the Smiths. Okay, that's the second. Third one, Man on the Moon. 2015. Through her telescope, a girl sees a lonely old man on the moon and sets about sending her a gift for Christmas. A telescope of his own, so that he can see that he's not alone. To the sound of Half the World Away by Oasis. Fourth, unexpected guest from 2021. Romance returns in this advert, which sees an alien crash-landed on Earth and fall for the boy who teaches her all about Christmas. To the sound of electropop classic Together in Electric Dreams by Phil Oakey and Giorgio Moroder. Okay. You got 4. The fifth one, The Gift of Love. This was 2007. A multi-generational message about the value of thought over extravagant gesture. Children excitedly remove the wrapping from a cornucopia of gifts, while behind them their moist-eyed grandparents exchange modest tokens of affection. Gardening gloves, an I Heart Arthur tea mug, to the sound of Blondie's I'm Always Touched by Your Presence, Dear.
You've gone too far with that last one. It was all going so well. You just couldn't resist Presence, Dear, could you? Because that would have been an old smash hits headline in bits when you give people Christmas present ideas. The headline would have been, I'm always touched by your presence.
It probably would have been.
It would have been.
It was, but it should have been.
It should have been. So I'm sorry. I was going to say that the Smiths one was the made-up one, but now
it does sound made up.
I'm changing it to It's Blondie as the last one.
I am completely rumbled, I'm afraid. But yeah, there it is. But I was rather amazed to see Richard. You probably would have seen it. It's all over the time.
I have seen it, actually.
Richard Ashcroft. I just love the idea that I remember seeing a very, very early Verve gig, and these guys were real alt kind of indie rock prophets and messiahs, weren't they? And the idea they finish up years later as the soundtrack, very lucratively, let's not mock it, for a John Lewis ad is quite funny, really. Anyway, you win.
It can't be that lucrative anymore, surely, can it? I don't know.
No, maybe not. It's very good publicity.
Much as I love John Lewis, and I do love John Lewis, I can't believe that it's as Christmas at John Lewis is quite as money spinning as it used to be in the kind of pre-Amazon days. Not quite the same kind of thing. Do you know what I like about John Lewis? It's the kind of place you go to buy the thing that you buy reluctantly. If you have to replace a bed or a carpet or, cooker
fridge.
Or whatever, a fridge, you go to John Lewis and you can be guaranteed that you will be served by a middle-aged person who will know more about that product category than you thought it was possible to know anywhere in the world. You know what I mean? Somebody who will drone on for you for hours about cookers or washing machines or whatever. I do like that. I'm a great admirer of that, that they've got those.
Which you don't get in record shops. Well, then again, you don't get record shops.
You don't get record shops. You don't get either. In fact, I've bemoaned this, in the past on podcasts. On the rare occasions you go into shops nowadays, you're shocked by the fact that the service doesn't appear to have improved, even though they're under all this online competition. You know what I mean? People don't go the extra mile for you, but John Lewis they do. So long may they prosper.
Bless them.
Bless them. So what else were we going to talk about? We were talking about songs we can still recite. I can't remember how this came up. I think somebody got in touch with me and said that they could still remember, the lyrics of something that they'd learned at a very early age. And I was expressing to them my belief that I've arrived at recently, that pretty much all the stuff from my education that I can remember, I learned before the age of about 12.
This is true.
And I learnt it by rote. I'm talking about, obviously, the alphabet. Obviously, your times table.
I before E, except after C.
When the sound is E. All that kind of thing. 30 days has September. All that. And that very, very often.
Alone, which has but 28 days clear. 29 in each leap
year. Absolutely. Listen, this is really valuable stuff.
Oh, it is. The Kings of England, Willie, Harry Stee, Harry Dick John, Harry III. I mean, all these things that you learned. Do you know the most ludicrous thing I ever learned at school?
Go on.
It was, you wouldn't have, did you get this one? Brom 4689.
Oh, no, go on.
Brom 4689 was an imaginary telephone number which helped you remember Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde, and Malplaquet.
Wow.
And their dates, which was 1704, 1706, 1708, 1709. And I can still remember that. Dave, those are the wars of Spanish succession. What value has that had in my life ever? The wars of Spanish succession. I can remember the dates and I can remember the names of them. Do I remember anything interesting about Queen Victoria or the Industrial Revolution or Henry VIII, which is piping hot at the moment, obviously with Wolf Hall back on the telly? No, I don't. My brain is clogged up with these useless facts.
Talking of Henry VIII, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived.
There's another one.
That's another one, that you learn.
Which is useful. That's useful.
It is really useful. I frequently, honestly, I do not infrequently consult that. When I land on I'm halfway through an episode of Wolf Hall comes on and think, now where are we? It's Jane Seymour or whatever, and I consult that kind of thing. But of course, the same thing applies to pop lyrics. And and I was thinking about this, that the impression made upon me by the lyrics of Bob Dylan in 1964, I suppose, from those records, The Times Are Changing, and Another Side of Bob Dylan, and Freewheeling Bob Dylan, is they all had these lyrics of, they were ballads, weren't they? They were structured like old-fashioned ballads that people used to, they were built for the kind of oral tradition, weren't they? That Victorians used to sing, or people earlier on, and people would remember them because they were in song form.
And beautiful to recite, because a lot of them were in 3-time Dylan songs.
Oh, right, yes, of
William
course.
Zanzinger killed poor Hattie Carroll, and a Caine 12 on his diamond-ringed fingers at a Baltimore Hotel Society gathering. Cops was called in, his weapons took from him as they rode him in custody down to the station. But William Zanzinger for first-degree murder, 123, 123. Those things are really...
You who philosophize disgrace and criticize my fears, take the rag away from your face, for now is the time for your tears. It's just, how can we...
You got me, I can do the whole of that song, I'd probably do it in under 2 minutes, which I'm not going to do now. It's weird. You can just remember them.
It is extraordinary, And I don't remember I don't remember Beatles songs in quite the same way. You know, that I suppose I remember all these Bob Dylan songs because I can remember the beginning. And therefore, if you remember the beginning, you can work your way to the ending. You know what I mean? It's very clear how the story starts.
You hear The Guilty Undertaker Sighs or With Your Mercury Mouth and the Missionary Times. You're off. You're off.
Yes.
But the thing about the Beatles, I used to think that Dylan stuff, God, Sad Eyed Lady is another waltz, isn't it? With your 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Yeah, how interesting. Waltzes, very attractive. But the Beatles, I never thought of that as kind of poetry, weirdly. Whereas Dylan, I thought of as poetry. So my schoolboy mind kind of could adopt that and memorize it quite easily. Whereas I just thought of the Beatles records as records, really. And you didn't sit there and I can recite lots of Beatles lyrics, but not as easily. It's weird.
And the other one I was thinking of last night when I was just thinking about this is Leonard Cohen, very early Leonard Cohen.
Oh, yeah.
Suzanne takes you down to a place by the river.
Yeah.
And she feeds you tea and oranges that come all the way from China. And just when you mean to tell her you have no love to give her, she gets you on your wavelength and she lets the river answer that you've always been a lover. It's just absolutely extraordinary.
I can do the whole thing. Yeah.
You can do the whole thing, you know. And so I think it's a combination.
Even those ones in French. Amazing.
Which ones?
The Partisan, half of which is in French.
Oh, right, yes.
They're still doing that.
Yeah.
They came across the border, they were cautioned to surrender. This I could not do. You remember? Fantastic.
Yes. And so it's a combination of the kind of the structure of the way the songs are, but also it's just the age you're at when they enter your mind. And I don't think anything you learn later on ever sticks quite the same way, you know.
No,
it's as if these things implanted themselves in your memory when your memory was, to coin a phrase, a greenfield site. There's very little in it.
I feel that if I'm going to learn something new, I've got to erase a file that's already there.
Yeah.
I've got to get rid of Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde, and Malplaquet. Before I can remember what it is I've got to buy at Waitrose at 12 o'clock this morning. But whereas when I was a kid, I think also with Dylan, I think that I thought of those things when I was 12, 13, 14, 15, whatever, as being immensely important. They were more important to me than all the other stuff I was reading. So, you know, if you said to me, "Oh, the rag man draws the circles," you know, I'd be away.
Up and down the block.
It is weird, isn't it?
It is very strange, and you know, nothing you learn later on ever goes in quite the same way.
The Word Podcast, prime cuts of popular culture served fresh each week.
Also thinking about my early years this week in listening to, not reading, the Craig Brown book about the Queen. What's it called, Mark? I don't even know the title. I've been listening to it on Audible.
I think it's called A Voyage Around the... Yeah, it's called A Voyage Around the Queen.
Which is done in the same style as his previous books on the Beatles and Princess Margaret. And one of the things he has a chapter about, it's terribly well done. It's really good.
It's fantastic.
He has a chapter about the national anthem and the part it played in our lives. And he's not far off my age, I suppose. And so if you're brought up in the 50s or 60s, you know, you forget the extent to which the national anthem played a part in your life. You know, that it used to be played at the end of every cinema film or theatrical performance. You know, so if you get the pantomime or whatever, there would be the national anthem at the end, wouldn't there? And he traces the story, I think via the Beatles, actually, of in the early days of Beatlemania, there would be, you know, they would go and play, I don't know, Peterborough, the ABC in Peterborough or whatever, and there would be mayhem and screaming and people flinging themselves.
Yeah, this is the Cambridge Regal, isn't it?
And then at the end, he would have to stop for the national anthem. But then it started to slip, didn't it? During that tour, he actually, I can remember, he names the gig the first night it's not really played. Is that right?
He names there's two things. There's one is, I think this is the one in Cambridge. This would have been 1963, I suppose. And he said he's watching, the guy writes this piece, he's watching the audience, the reviewer, And he says they're in a real state of excitement. The national anthem comes on and they're immediately quiet and respectful. Then they go mental for the time the Beatles on, just screaming and yelling and weeping and pulling their hair. And the moment the national anthem comes on, they all pull themselves together and sit there really meekly. And then after that, people start to ignore it, which is really interesting. They just think, right, the national anthem, we're still high as kites about the Beatles and we're just walking out,
Yeah, it's you could say, I'm sure you could build the theory that the Beatles kind of replaced the royal family at that point. The royal family used to be, in the 50s. I remember my Uncle Tom, if the national anthem came on the television, he would stand up.
Oh, yeah.
In the living room, he would stand up. My father didn't, but my Uncle Tom did. The guys who'd served in the forces, in the Second World War. And so the royal family attracted kind of not so much affection, but just kind of deference and obedience and so forth. And it was that was sort of replaced by the affection and deference and obedience of the Beatles, really, in the 60s. I thought it was absolutely fascinating.
He also quotes the second verse of there are 5 verses to God Save the
Queen, which nobody's ever sung.
Which I didn't even know that one. O Lord, our God, arise, scatter our enemies, and make them fall, confound their politics, frustrate their knavish tricks. On thee our hopes we fix. God save us all. It's ludicrous.
I think there's actually, isn't there a mention in one of those verses of rebellious Scots? I think there is.
Yeah, I think there is, yeah. I don't think they're allowed to sing that anymore.
I'm sure
we're recording this 2 or 3 days after the King's birthday, and I turned on Radio 4, and at the moment when they were playing God Save the Queen, and I immediately thought, has he died? What's that? I didn't know what they were playing it for. When I discovered it was his birthday, that really did seem anachronistic.
And you still refer to...
The nation was still stopping in 2024, November.
You still referring to it as God Save the Queen, which...
Did I say that?
That's what you just said. You were talking about the King's birthday being marked by the playing of God Save the Queen.
Shows you how entrenched these things are.
Absolutely.
But the thing that struck me about Craig Brown's book, anybody listening who's read these books, Craig Brown's written, as Dave was saying, one about, it's called Ma'am Darling, about Princess Margaret, then one about the Beatles, and then one about the Queen. I'm trying to think whether there are any subjects left, because I think this is really interesting. These are subjects so enormous, and they're beyond, way, way beyond the idea of just being national treasures or whatever. These are people, it has to suggest warmth, it has to have an infinite source of stories, and they must be people who've met absolutely everybody. So very few people, and you must have an eternal, and there must be a happy ending. It can't be a down story. It can't be, Marilyn Monroe or something, because that's going to end on a very low note. I came up with, and I don't think of any of these are quite good enough, actually. Elvis Presley, I don't know. That's not got a happy ending. Noel Coward, not big enough, probably. Churchill, fascinating, but only to a certain generation. Bob Dylan, possibly. Jack Nicholson, don't know. Michael Caine, Queen Victoria, David Bowie, it's possible. The Stones, Frank Sinatra.
I had a suggestion, which I've thought about this, and I'm confident it trumps all of your suggestions.
Go on.
This one would work. David Beckham.
Oh, yeah, that's good.
David Beckham would work because every person in the UK knows who David Beckham is and has some kind of imagined relationship with them.
That's good.
And he's lived his life in public for a long, long time, and there's a family dimension to it. David Beckham would kind of work.
So huge, wasn't it?
Which one?
The recent documentary was so good and so huge. And even people like my sisters who had no interest in it at all, I just said, you've got to watch this. I know you don't like football. I don't know you watch it.
It's nothing to do with football. Nothing to do with football.
It's really just to do with celebrity and drive. And it's an extraordinary story.
It's to do with celebrity so huge, it kind of, it outranks celebrity, doesn't it? It's on another plane.
I remember
you should say the same thing about the Beatles.
You texted me not long ago and you said, I am standing in a queue with the most famous person I've ever seen in my life who doesn't have with them a bodyguard. I remember trying to think who on earth it could be. Could it be Paul McCartney, whatever? And it was David Beckham. You were in a queue in a farm, a sort of very high top end farm shop,
very high end,
and there he was.
There he was. No, I still insist he's the most famous person I've ever seen without a minder. And and I would argue, and I did argue at the time, that he's more famous than Paul McCartney. Because if you landed David Beckham in China in the year 2024, people would know who he was. And the same thing wouldn't apply to
true.
To Paul McCartney. It's a completely different level. So yes, that's Craig Brown's book about the Queen.
It's amazing,
which is very good.
It's fantastic.
This is a junction in the word podcast. It separates that bit from this next bit,
which sort of leads to a text you sent me the other day about the American journalist and pundit David Brooks. Mm-hmm. And it was really interesting. There's a little clip you sent me, and he's talking about the value of education. This was in kind of in the shadow of the election, really, and making the point that very broadly that people who left school in America, left high school, didn't go on to further education, tended to vote Republican, and that people who went to college tended to vote Democrat. And he'd extended that into what other characteristics people who were, as you were, college educated and not college educated had. And it's interesting if you kind of apply this a bit to music, because there are certain, I was trying to think if there was some kind of crass summary I could do of this, in that the kind of musicians who didn't go to college have various characteristics, don't they? They tend to have immense drive and ambition. They tend to have an absolutely unflagging desire to be commercial. They tend to be really hardworking. They tend to be really good team players. Posh musicians, again, this is a monstrous generalization, tend to regard artistic success as being as valuable as commercial success. They're not as good, I think, at talking to each other, at sorting out internal problems. They're less good, I think, with dealing with failure. And they're possibly, again, a generalization, harder to manage. They're people who tend to have issues with authority, more likely to have issues with authority, and be less driven. So where does that leave us? I don't know.
One of the points he makes, he talks about, I think he refers to the diploma divide as the new divide in American society. And I think quite a lot of this you could apply to the UK, and that you got whole generations growing up with education is their objective, and he says there is no direct read across from academic success to success in business or in real life, which I think is the key point he makes, actually. And, that...
how true that is.
And it's so profoundly true. And you and I have had direct experience of this, which I'm going to talk about this. You and I used to work for a big publishing company, a big publicly quoted publishing company, where the brightest people at the very top, you could barely summon a university education between half a dozen of them. You know what I mean? And yet you'd get loads of people writing for magazines or whatever, degrees coming out their ears, who couldn't find their backside with a flashlight. Really, you saw that really clearly in front of you, in terms of they could tell you how problems ought to be solved, but didn't have the ghost of a clue of how to go about it. Not a ghost. And of course, their educational attainment had made them blind to the things that they didn't have. You know what I mean? Disrespectful of the things that they didn't have. And I think that's the thing that's gotten worse over the last 20, 30 years. I mean, I don't know, at school and college or whatever in the 60s and 70s, when people still had holiday jobs. And when you went away from university, you went to work on the post or whatever, and you worked alongside normal people. And you learned a lot from normal people. People don't do that anymore.
I worked for ages in a tractor factory. I learned more in that period of my life than any other. It's fantastic.
So Tom Maloney, old colleague of ours, he once said to me, he said, the most important day of your life is the first day you go for a job. It's the first day you start a job, because it's only then that you realise you're not special.
I know.
It is so true.
The point that David Brooks made so clearly at the top was this link between academic success and qualification and success in life. He said life is a completely different thing.
Absolutely.
And it's still like that now. He got 7 A stars, therefore he'll be all right. That is not a given at all, not remotely. No. The idea that you're academically qualified doesn't mean that you're in any way able to operate collaboratively.
Absolutely.
And you and I know that from our entire work experience that nearly all of it has been collaborative. Nearly all has been in an office with people, getting on with them, understanding how they work, them understanding you, building a team, making things better because there's more of you. And all that stuff is not something we learn sitting around working out when the Battle of Ramillies and Alplaqué was. It just is.
This podcast is going to be called The Battles of Ramillies and Malplaquet.
I know.
But it's interesting going back to your kind of pop equivalents. If you read Nick Mason's book, I can't remember what it's called. It's a very good book, all about Pink Floyd. And Nick Mason is constantly reflecting upon the fact that they had all the education in the world. They all came from very nice backgrounds, but they couldn't speak to each other at all. They had the most intractable, self-imposed problems very often. You know what I mean? That they never got beyond.
I do think it's interesting. You can't make any generalizations out of it, but if you look at the Floyd, the moment things got tense, they fell apart.
Yeah.
They allowed resentment to build and build and build and build until it exploded without ever talking to each other. The Beatles talked to each other the entire time. They had arguments, they brought them out in the open and they argued about them. And they stormed out, they left the group and they came back or whatever. Beatles had the best combination, actually, which is the kind of uneducated, driven, motivated, ambitious rock and roll band with the posh manager at the time, when a posh manager is what you needed to get into a music industry largely run by posh people, a media largely run by posh people, a BBC. Don't you think?
Yeah, maybe. It's probably true.
I mean, I think if you think of that at that time, everybody, even people like George Martin and Brian Epstein, who actually came from reasonably modest backgrounds, were affecting to be far posher than they were.
That's the way you do it.
I think it's interesting, and I think that can you see, is there a difference between the kind of U2's approach, who never went to college, or Coldplay? I don't know. I mean, the interesting thing in that case is that they're all still going, partly, I think, because they divided up the royalties. I think they all have the same thing, that they share the royalties between them. Possibly not the lyrics. I think Bono gets 2/5 of the royalties and the others get a fifth each or whatever, because he writes the lyrics. But I think that's interesting. So R.E.M., Blur, Radiohead, Red Hot Chili Peppers, all those groups who shared the lyrics are still going on. But I don't know. The poshest act ever, Dave. I can tell you the poshest act ever.
Go on.
It's an easy one. It's Nick Drake.
Yes.
Is it? Nick Drake is the quintessentially posh star, because he was told he was a genius by all this. He was his friends and his family and his manager. He's never criticised. He expected the world was going to fall into his lap. He wouldn't work particularly hard for success. He couldn't deal with failure. He'd had no experience of it, actually, and he wouldn't collaborate, and he couldn't form friendships. He never really trusted anybody. Just not a team player. So I think he's a really good example.
Yeah.
And if you look at kind of non-educated, as it were, people, a complete polar opposite to Nick Drake, I think, is Rod Stewart. It's the best example.
Right.
Rod Stewart, youngest of 5 kids, living above a newsagent's. You know what I mean? It's this old football's ambition to get out, ambition to improve your life.
Gravedigger. Wasn't it?
Gravedigger, busker, then skiffle and mod and rock. I mean, and the other thing about it, which was so brilliant, was that kind of fabulous thing that when he made money, he flaunted it. He wasn't kind of middle class, but he didn't try and hide his wealth.
No,
He went, look what I have earned.
That's true.
If you got it, flaunt it. The richer he got, the more he had kind of trophy girlfriends and fast cars. There was a thing about him in the paper 2 days ago.
Yes, about potholes in
potholes
Essex.
in his road, and there's a picture of him beside maybe 6 or 7 of the most
supercars,
priceless and gorgeous-looking automobiles I've ever seen in my life. And he can't resist in this, which is effectively a news item about potholes, telling you that he bought the first one with his royalties that he made from the Fasces, I think in 1971 or whatever, and that he's collected these cars all his life, but he's going to have to sell them up soon, because he can't drive them down his own road because it's too full of potholes. He can't miss the chance to remind you just how successful he's been. Bless him. I think that's brilliant.
He was out with a road gang, wasn't he, about a year ago, filling in
the potholes.
Potholes with Rod in some kind of priceless cashmere scarf thrown around his neck, pretending to shovel tarmac into potholes.
Have you got your picture? Got your snap?
Yes. All right, darling.
All right, Smudger, get a couple of snaps because I'm going back home watching the football. No, but Rod Stewart's had one kind of work ethic all his life, which is achieve a kind of level of lifestyle that you like and then try and sustain it from there on in. Good for him. He's absolutely brilliant.
Absolutely.
So that's my theory. Those are the greatest polar opposites, Nick Drake and Rod Stewart.
The Word Podcast, 2 cocoa tins and a piece of string.
I was just reading this thing about someone I know, actually, a novelist called Louisa Young, and she's just been commissioned to write the next 3 novels by Elizabeth Jane Howard, who I think is her aunt, actually. So she's continuing the tradition of Elizabeth Jane Howard by writing the next 3 Elizabeth Jane Howard novels.
Are these Cazalet books?
Yes, that's absolutely right. Yeah.
Wow,
Cazalet.
My wife's a huge fan of Elizabeth Jane Howard.
I think it's very interesting. Because,
God, she's an interesting woman in herself. You know the backstory of her. She married Kingsley Amis.
Yeah, she's the one who made Martin Amis.
Work.
Just made him do some work. Said, read this book and just pull yourself together.
Yes.
And he said he owed everything to her.
Absolutely.
She's an amazing character.
And she churned out these Cazalet saga books, which are on one level kind of, mid-market potboilers. On another level, absolutely gripping. Absolutely gripping. My wife read them and absolutely adored them. And so when we drove to Italy a couple of years ago, we listened to the whole saga all the way there and all the way back. God, it was fun. They're such good books. Anyway,
the other great evangelist for Elizabeth Jane Howard is Hilary Mantel. Hilary Mantel used to go on about her repeatedly and say, you have to read these books. They're fantastic. But anyway, I thought there might be, and this has been going on a while because obviously people have been writing new Bond novels, etc., etc. So it's not a new thing, but I think it's interesting. And I noticed the other day a parallel in pop music in that there are 3 groups going at the moment who consist of ex-members of the band whose music they're trying to continue, but they're not tribute bands. So the three groups are Black Star Riders, which is a group that's formed by Scott Gorham, and they play the music. They put out records. They're not cover versions. It's music they imagine Thin Lizzy would be making if Thin Lizzy was going.
No, sure,
right?
Yeah.
So these are 3 groups, all of whom their lead singers are no longer with us. The other one's The Fall. Various ex-members of The Fall have formed a group called House of All. And again, I listened to some of them. It's really good. Although it just sounds obviously a bit like a Marquis Smith pastiche, which in some respects is quite easy to do. And the third one, which features the son of Mark Hollis, who died a while back now, Charlie Hollis, is Held by Trees, who are perpetuating the music of Talk Talk. I just thought it was just an interesting thing. I don't know if people... I'm going to ask my eldest son, who's the world's greatest and most ardent Fall fan, whether or not he would ever listen to this group, House of All. I think the answer would be no, because he would say there is so much Fall music already available to listen to.
That's true.
Why wouldn't you go back and listen to some obscure record, a live recording I did in Paris, which is actually Marquis Smith and Marquis Smith's lyrics, rather than...
It's a bit like relaunching the Magic Band and pretending to be Captain Beefheart, isn't it, really?
It is.
It's just a personality sound. You'd be doing an impression of them. Because the fingerprint of The Fall is Marquis Smith. There's not anything else at all. Yeah.
completely. I remember going to see the Blockheads a couple of times when they had their. And I've now completely forgotten his name. Who was the roadie you took over and sang? Derek. Yeah.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yes. Go on. But they were good, weren't they?
They were really good. But his whole thing was to. I can't remember. There'll be people listening who'll be shouting at their devices.
This proves we're doing this live. We don't know.
I know.
You're listening to the Word Podcast. It's not supposed to be professional.
So that's about it for this week because we're losing our memory. But if, as I could tell many of you have been sitting there all the way through this with a pen and paper poised, thinking to yourself, oh, please, I want to help in any way I can to keep this valuable enterprise going as it's been going since 2006. Well, there is a way you can do it. And so this is what you have to write down. If you go to patreon.com/word in your ear, you can find out how you could get involved. And who knows, if you get involved at the right kind of level, you could be joining us on the occasion of your birthday to throw a log on the Word in Your Ear conversational fire. An honour which this week is extended to Giles Fraser.
The Word Podcast. Fix yourself a drink and it's like being in the pub.
So this week's birthday guest is a long-time Patreon supporter. Giles, hello, Giles. How are you doing? How many times have we done this?
I think this is the fourth time. I think this is the fourth time, maybe the fifth, including when we did the inaugural hour or whatever it was.
Right, of course.
Yeah, but I'm back for more.
So it's very rare to get a podcast without Giles Fraser.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That's the way we like it. It's good.
Yeah.
So, as is customary, you've got a conversational log to toss on the fire. What is it?
I have. Just a quick warning, though. It's just gone 10. We're in an Airbnb in Bath. We're meant to be out by 10. So if I suddenly disappear, it's because they've turned the lights and the electricity and the Wi-Fi off.
The sound of your suitcase being hurled out into the street.
Precisely. But anyway, we'll see how we go. Yeah, so I actually was thinking about your podcast, having listened to virtually all of them over the last, whatever it is, 20 years. I can't remember how long it is. But I was thinking about who has the sort of the nicest and most engaging voices of the people you've interviewed. Because I do think, on a podcast, the voice is vital, isn't it, in terms of, your willingness to keep listening and your enjoyment.
Do you mean people we've interviewed or people
you've interviewed, yeah.
Wow.
Well, it's funny, I was thinking only the other day when you do all these chats with people and most of them are perfectly acceptable. And then occasionally you get one and think, God, he's got a good voice. It's Jacko. What's Jacko's second
Jacko Jaksic.
Jacko Jaksic, who we talked to about his time in King Crimson and so forth. And Jacko had a fantastic voice because he's partly an actor, isn't he, Mark? He got that in his background. And that really does make a difference. And the other one was, only the other day, Elliot Mintz, who'd written the book about John Lennon.
He's a radio broadcaster.
He's a radio broadcaster, and so he had an immensely listenable voice, and also had very much thought about what he was going to say and said it, with no hesitation, no repetition, or whatever it is that they say on.
He was very, very, very clear, wasn't he? Very sparse, but. There
was nothing in the sentence that didn't need to be there at all.
Hemingway-esque.
I like people who I like certain accents. I think of people we've talked to. I think Midge Ure's got a fabulous voice, and Bob Geldof too, and I think Nick Lowe too, actually. But particularly, I'm very taken with Scottish and Irish accents.
Yeah, it's true. The Irish voice. I mean, you can't help but think with Irish guests, it's just a national characteristic, isn't it? They produce so many broadcasters, and it may just be my good fortune, but all the Irish people I end up talking to are always very engaging talkers and have a kind of musical quality to their voice. Yeah. So, but also Scottish people, I think that's certainly the
Armando
case.
Iannucci's got a new podcast called Strong Message Here with Helen Lewis. He has a fabulous voice, I think. Just wonderful. Every phrase has really interesting ways of pronouncing certain syllables. He's just so listenable.
Yeah. There's a podcast. Do you ever listen to that Sam Harris podcast?
I have listened to that, yes.
Sam Harris is very good, but he has the inestimable advantage of having this extraordinary dark brown voice. So he can just talk really slowly, and you listen to him, you're hanging on his every syllable, So who have you been your favourites, Charles? What do you think?
I suppose there's four that came to mind. If in just sort of ascending order up to number one for me, I think Neil Tennant's got a fantastic voice. It helps that you two have such amazing, rapport and heritage with him. But he's just so I think he's so engaging, and he's just so self-deprecating.
The inflections of his speech are so funny.
I think he's got great. Precisely. Yeah.
Yeah, so much of that with Neil is just manner, isn't it?
Yeah.
And
so he would be in there. I think you mentioned Nick Lowe, and I think because he's got such brilliant stories, and he's also, I love the way he litters his conversation with 1940s sort of RAF phrases.
Yes, that's true. It's rarely far away, that kind of thing. Yeah,
it's so funny.
And then probably equal first. Yeah, keep going. So,
well, that puts the absolute tin lid on it.
Yes, that's right.
Wonderful old archaic. His father would have said things like that.
Yeah,
so go on.
I love all those stories he comes up with.
Two and one now. Okay.
Yeah, well, I think equal first. Claire Grogan, going back to your Scottish.
Oh, there you go.
I mean, it's very hard not to think, gosh, I wish it was 6 o'clock on a Friday and we were in the pub with her when you listen to her talk.
Yeah.
As we always say, when the subject of Claire Grogan comes up, take a ticket.
Yeah, precisely.
There's a long queue.
What's his favourite? She's painted on the tail wing. Of the Wernurier aircraft.
Many years ago, I sat on the Circle line next to her for a journey, but I didn't. I was too shy to say hello. Or ongoing regret.
Oh dear,
yeah.
She would have
Who's
been
number one.
Phil Manzanera.
Oh right.
I think he's got a brilliant voice. I think he articulates so well. It's really. It may a bit reflect to the fact he's sort of been all around the world, but he's just beautiful.
Yeah, lovely mixture of
accents. He could, if he would be a very good Radio 4 Today presenter.
Radio
in my
4
view.
Documentary presenter, precisely.
I think he's number one for me so far. I'm sure there's many brilliant ones, but I just think he's really interesting, and he's just he's also very empathetic. I think he comes across as someone who's as interested in the person who's being he's talking to us.
Yeah, which is a rare quality.
Although there was a revelation when we talked to him that he wished that the other members of Roxy Music would write autobiographies because he knew nothing about them. so that's an indication of how little bands talk to each other. But yes, he is normally interested.
It's a very good book. I have to say, I read the book.
Yeah, really good.
It's fascinating. Some of his early childhood.
It is.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Well, okay, those are your nominations, Charles.
Yeah,
and no doubt
that's helpful.
If people have got other ones, there's no doubt tons of people we've completely forgotten because we've done hundreds of these things over the years. But it's always good to have your support, Charles.
This podcast was brought to you by The Word.